12. My Life in Atlantis. I could hear it from far away, that sound which only very big cities can produce, a sound consisting of all sounds rolled into one, the hum of voices and the cries of animals, bells ringing and the chink of coins, children's laughter and hammers beating metal, knives and forks clattering, and 1,000 doors slamming, the grandiose sound of life, of birth, and death itself. I made for the city like a dog hauled along on a leash, slowly and rather fearfully at first, then faster and faster, until I broke into a long run. Atlantis seemed to exert a magnetic attraction. The louder the hum of the city became, the more I itched to find out who or what was making all those sounds. At last I stood panting outside the gate, only one of many, but I didn't discover until later. Looming over me were 2 black marble columns at least 60 feet high. They bore a plaque engraved with the following words: Atlantis, city with a future. Between the columns stood an impressive individual 3 times my size and 3 times as hairy, with glassy red eyes and twice as many teeth in his mouth. In his hand was an implement that would have lent itself to innumerable uses. On his head a military-style peaked cap of blown glass. Although I didn't know it at the time, he was a trooper in the Municipal Guard, a unit traditionally recruited from Yetis alone. The Yeti looked down at me sternly and tapped his cap with the implement. The glass gave out a high-pitched ping. Hello there, are you a human being, or directly related to, or on close terms with, or related by marriage to, or financially dependent upon, or romantically involved with any member of the human race? No, I replied, I'm a Bluebear. Of course you are. I'm not a half-wit. I have to ask. It's my job. Welcome to Atlantis, the city of the future. I see that griffin up there? He leveled his tool at the summit of a minaret, jutting into the sky behind him. Seated on the topmost parapet was a huge griffin. Yes, I replied. It's a genuine griffin. Do you know what that means? No, I said. It means it's a genuine griffin. He gave me a long, enigmatic look, then waved me on. Just as I was looking past him with my head down, the ground suddenly shook. It was only a slight tremor. The Yeti and I swayed a little. Then it stopped. What was that? I asked. An earthquake. It's harmless. We get lots of them. Welcome to Atlantis. From the Encyclopedia of Marvels, Life Forms, and Other Phenomena of Zamonia and its Environs by Professor Abdullah Nightingale, Atlantis, capital and seat government of the continent of Zamonia, classified as Megalopolis. Atlantis is divided into 5 administrative districts, each of which really constitutes a kingdom in its own right. Nautilus, Sitnalta, Titilans, and thanks, but we already know that. At the time of my arrival, Atlantis was by way of being the world center for non- or half-human life forms. Human beings were simply not admitted in consequence of the Zamonia War of Succession. It happened like this. Human beings used to make up 1/3 of the population of Atlantis until they and Norselanders became embroiled in a dispute over which would be mayor of the city, which in practice meant governor of all Zamonia. City Hall had been controlled by the Norselanders for several generations, and the mayoral office continued to be handed down from father to son until one day the inhabitants condemned this as a nepotism and demanded free elections. Some heated arguments ensued, at first of verbal nature only, but opposing camps ended by resorting to violence. Zamonian War of Succession. In the course of the wholesale free-for-all that broke out during a debate in the municipal senate between human and Norselander politicians, the Norselander was pushed out of the window in the general confusion and broke his ear. The structure of a Norselander's ear is very complex with a fragile osseous system. With considerable diplomatic skill, the Norselanders took advantage of this incident to form an alliance with almost all the city's other non- or semi-human life forms, thereby imposing what amounted to a strict local ban on humans. The latter resentfully immigrated to other continents, where, in spirit of defiance, so to speak, they founded metropolises such as Rome, Constantinople, and London, from which semi- or non-human life forms, and Norselanders in particular, were debarred in their turn. The ban on human beings. What resulted was the breach between humans, semi-humans, and non-humans that persists to this day. That is why dwarfs, demons, troglotrolls, witches, and other non-human manifestations hide themselves away from human eyes. A similar fate attended to the few humans remaining in Zamonia, who either steered clear of Atlantis or went off into the desert like the ones I got to know in Tornado City. The Antlerites. So Atlantis was ruled by Norselanders. These rather disagreeable creatures allegedly hailed from Norway or possibly from Iceland. They were reputed to have reached Atlantis by clinging to the Viking ships. A myth, perhaps, but one that does at least say much for their stamina. Norselanders were elks with human bodies. They walked erect and extremely long, sensitive, protruding ears. It's hard to say what made them in particular such good politicians. Perhaps it was their ultra-sensitive hearing. According to one Atlantean proverb, a Norselander could hear the wind change before the wind itself became aware of it. Clods, hazel witches, glacier gophers, and other Atlanteans. Other denizens of Atlantis included Florenthian clods, a very sociable species of large dogbat with wings and dark fur, melanospites, Gralsundian hazel witches, North Simonian zombies, harvest home hamsters, glacier gophers whose ancestors came from Greenland, shivering sound shrews, and scampering hordes of much-water mannequins. Most of the inhabitants of Zamonia originated on other continents. Among them were the Italian doombirds. These strange hybrids, a cross between a human and a chicken, resembled normal farmyard fowl in outward appearance, but spoke in deep bass tones, generally of impending disaster. Beneath Atlantis' numerous bridges resided the Bodkins, a timid race of likable, helpful little gnomes who voluntarily collected the city's refuse at night. Also living on the waterfront in corrugated iron shacks were the Wildings, a fascinating bunch of hybrids, at times half human, half fish, at other times half goat, half insect. Much to everyone's relief, they kept themselves to themselves. Bufadistas and Bloodums. At the street corners sat bufadistas, toad-like creatures from Portugal who sang melancholy ditties about unrequited love and other injustices. Passers-by were rudely pestered for coins by fearsome-looking bloodums, from the waist-up shaggy black bears with huge projecting teeth, below that bony humans with blood-red skin and preternaturally large feet. Bloodums were always to be found where uncouth behavior was called for. Simonian Wolpertingers were universally respected but ever so slightly feared because of the mock battles they staged with much clashing of antlers. Their ancestors came from Lapland. Antlers apart, they looked almost like normal canines, except that they were 10 feet tall and walked on their hind legs. Most Wolpertingers hired themselves out as bodyguards or bouncers. Cookbooks baked little yeast cakes on open grass fires and sold them so cheaply that they had, to all intents and purposes, become staple food. Very small, spherical in shape, and entirely covered with fur, cookbooks were of pure Zamonian stock. Legend had it that they grew in the graveyard marshes of Dole. Rickshaw demons. Responsible for transportation were Chinese rickshaw demons, unutterably hideous creatures with huge calf muscles. They simply perched you on their humpbacks, however much you weighed, and raced off like the wind. Sedge gnomes. The African Tengawangas were sedge gnomes, not much bigger than the children of 3, are immensely quick, strong, and pugnacious. The Irish druids, by contrast, were peaceable but not wholly innocuous. They were said to be able to turn you into a harp or a lump of peat if you insulted their native island. Trificers. The Central Indian Trificers, though something of a past, were quite harmless. They always appeared in threes, of course, and made a practice of handling out muddle-headed and philosophical tracts. Noontide ghouls. The noontide ghouls who hailed from Asia and preferred to get up to their tricks in the middle of the day looked like paper cutouts. Nobody knew what to make of them. Ghosts that appear during the day are not very impressive after all, because they forfeit their spooky appearance. Having disembodied spirit in your home in broad daylight is merely a nuisance, nothing more. The noontide ghouls were undeterred, however, and would continue their monkey business even when you ignored them and got on with your lunch. Dracs. The Dracs, amusing little mini-dragons belonging to the goblin family, were good-natured, well-meaning house spirits. They had nothing in common with big, fire-breathing dragons, apart from their physical resemblance. Just as a dolphin isn't a fish but a mammal, so Dracs weren't dragons at all, but, well, something else. They even brought you good luck if you treated them with respect, and respect the Dracs meant mainly first-class board and lodging, but keeping them was rather like going in for the lottery. You could pamper them for years and get nothing in return, whereas someone else would invite a Drac to a meal just once, and the next day he would find a bucket full of gold on his doorstep. Dracs also had a curious knack for transforming themselves into wet dogs for brief periods, something they particularly liked to do on high days and holidays. Toothworms. Toothworms occupied the lowest rung of the social ladder. Originally natives of the Swiss Alps, they were somehow out of place in a big city. Persons of stable temperament were repelled by their subservient, groveling manner, but Bloodhams liked to keep them as salaried domestic pets and use them to fetch their newspapers for them. Griffins. Griffins, which were breathtakingly beautiful lion-eagle crossbreeds, and huge black wings like angels of death, they were Atlantis' unofficial police force and primarily responsible for the fact that the conditions in such vast chaotic city were so relatively peaceful. Everyone respected the Griffins not only because of their physical superiority, but above all for their Salomic integrity and sportsmanlike fairness, but symbols of justice carved in granite. They perched almost motionless on the tops of the city skyscrapers, minarets, and pyramids, their keen eyes scanning on the busy streets below. You had to have witnessed the arrival of a griffin to know how authority should be personified. Its wings created more noise and turbulence than a tornado, and when it dug its talons into the ground and opened its mighty beak to emit a roar worthy of a whole pride of lions, you stopped whatever you happened to be doing. Gargoyles. The griffins were assisted by gargoyles, a winged species of gnome whose appearance varied greatly. This was because the gargoyles of Atlantis came from a wide variety of continents and had inbred over the millennia. Some specimens had the bodies of humpbacked dwarfs and semi-human faces, others reptilian tails and dragons' heads, and others webbed feet and gnome-like features, but all had small leathery wings. They took care to any minor misdemeanors, traffic offenses, cases of shoplifting, nocturnal breaches of peace, etc., that would not have warranted the intervention of a griffin. It was the gargoyle's rather sinister appearance and somewhat brusque manner that accounted for the remarkably low crime rate in Atlantis. The stone figures of these creatures still seem to be seen on churches or old buildings in many modern cities that were carved by sculptors who at one time lived in Atlantis. Hoopoes. The hoopoes also had wings, but enjoyed considerably less respect. Indeed, nearly everyone pursued them because the rumor that their feathers brought good luck in matters of heart. That meant that only the proximity of a griffin could make a hoopoe feel reasonably secure. Not only were the seated griffins encircled by the usually fluttering gargoyles, a big flock of hoopoes would also be jostling for position in some nearby gutter. Big-footed birds. Big-footed birds were half-duck, half-bushwitch, more precisely women with duck's bills on top and ducks with very big women's feet below. They were entirely harmless, even though they cured everything and anyone that crossed their path. Quacking and vituperating, they restlessly roamed the streets of Atlantis on their own. And it must be accounted a blessing that no one understood their language except the birds themselves. Their profanities became truly dramatic when two of them happened to bump into each other. If this occurred at night, sleep was out of the question within a radius of 3 miles. Dragons. Atlantis had its dragons too, of course, over 500 of them, so it was said, though they were never seen. Sewer dragons lived in the subterranean part of the city, of which more later, because they really belonged to the scaleworm family, whose members favored cool, damp, unstressful conditions on account of their high blood pressure. For the present, as I shall say them, this: yes, they really can breathe fire. No, they don't abduct damsels in distress. Yes, they have human voices, at least the one I encountered did, and yes, they can become very, very vicious if you cross their path in the wrong moment. Duodwarfs. Duodwarfs walked around all over the place, quarreling with themselves, pathetic creatures belonging to the genus Contradictions. They comprised of a speaking head and a speaking stomach, and were always at odds over everything, no matter what. Chimeras. Chimeras were extremely annoying and unpopular creatures, members of the overweight pressure sprite family. They were enabled by their bat-like wings to gain access to any bedroom at night. They were to perch on the chests of slumbering citizens and give them nightmares. This did no one any good, not even the chimeras themselves, so the Norse hunters, with the griffins' tacit consent, declared them fair game. The only result, however, was that the chimeras transferred their roosts and hatcheries to even more secluded places, of which Atlantis had plenty. It was even rumored that the chimeras had discovered the secret tunnels leading to the Atlantean pyramids and installed themselves there. Popples. The Popples, who were good wood goblins and skilled craftsmen, did a roaring trade in pixie stars, which they produced with the aid of fret saws. Pixie stars were thought to be the only effective antidote to chimeras. If sawn aright, the only Popples were reputed to be able to saw them. Correctly. At least one pixie star hung in almost every Atlantean house, yet the nightmares occasioned by chimeras persisted. This gave rise to a rumor not only that Popples turned out shoddy work occasionally, but they were really in cahoots with the chimeras. Vampires. Vampires are a subject in themselves. Atlantis teamed with them, and one really shouldn't lump them all together. For a start, it entirely depended what they lived on, and very few of them lived on blood. Those that did were unpleasant creatures, of whom most lived in the ruins of the Italian cathedral, which no one in his right mind entered after sunset. Contrary to all modern descriptions, blood-sucking vampires looked like big dark-furred cats with balloon-like faces and the short leathery wings of a bat. Also, contrary to all the legends about them, they were not necessarily dependent on blood and quite capable of living on normal diet, even on garbage if they pulled themselves together. They were also blood-drinking vampires that acquired their blood by legal means. They purchased it from one of the numerous Atlantean blood-broking establishments. These vampires included Dwerog, spirit-like creatures with projecting teeth and good manners, Aeolian blood-surplers, obese mountain demons with two faces, and Transylvanian werewolves, which traditionally ran the said blood-broking business. Olfactyls. The remaining considerably more innocuous vampires were dependent on smell, touch, and hearing. One example of the first category was olfactyl, an extremely thin vampire, some 4 feet long and equipped with as many as 15 notices. Olfactyls fed exclusively on body odors of all kinds. Although superficially unattractive, this habit had a very practical side. If you smelt strongly of sweat after taking physical exercise, an olfactyl had only to nestle against you for a few seconds and inhale enough of its numerous noses for the unpleasant smell to disappear completely. There was also a rather less popular and considerably smaller olfactyl variety with only 4 noses but 8 legs. It specialized in halitosis and would clamber onto the faces of sleeping people at night to inhale their mouth odor. To wake up in the small hours and find a little snuffling olfactyl on your cheek could be a traumatic experience. Ear spoonlets. Even more innocuous and equally beneficial to society were the acoustic vampires popularly known as ear spoonlets, which lived on speech. They were a little bigger than dachshunds, but had hearing organs of which a young elephant need not have been ashamed. They spent most of their time lying around in public places and pricking up their ears, an extremely amusing sight. Ear spoonlets were capable of storing up all they had heard for months and regurgitating it before it was fully digested. Thus they were much in demand as itinerant purveyors of information or witnesses of arguments. You could easily annoy them by noiselessly opening and shutting your mouth as if talking. They made them bounce around like mad things, vainly trying to catch the words they thought they were missing. Pixies. The pixies or elves were not quite as likable and certainly not as cute and innocent as their modern reputation would have us believe. More like unpleasant insects, like highly intelligent wasps, so to speak. They were absolutely mad about anything sweet, which was why no one anywhere in Atlantis could eat a slice of cake without sharing it with at least one elf. The killing of pixies was prohibited because it not only brought bad luck, but was even alleged to spell the downfall of Atlantis. This rumor had gained such a general currency that no one could recall where it had originated, but I secretly suspected that it came from the pixies themselves. They probably kept whispering it in the inhabitants' ears at night. The cunning little creatures. Fang-fangs. As for the Fang-fangs, they were genuinely disagreeable individuals. They were really forest demons from the thickets of the outskirts of the city and had no business in a civilized metropolis. But once in a while, a drunken gang of them would stray into Atlantis. Not even the Yetis and the gates could turn them away, because the Fangs were not subject to any definite exclusion order. The Norselanders had been drafting one for years, but not, it was whispered, with any great enthusiasm, because they themselves were indirectly related to the intruders. Discounting their size and close-set human ears, Fangs bore a close superficial resemblance to Norselanders. The uncouth creatures were very tall even by Atlantean standards and could attain a height of 30 feet. They always operated in groups of 150 to 200, and the destructive power of such a contingent was equal to that of medium-sized Bolog. If a gang of them entered Atlantis, a fight was bound to break out sooner or later. It was usually the Bloodums they came to blows with, or oddly enough the diminutive Tangowangas, who would stand no nonsense for anyone. Whenever this happened, it took a dozen griffins to restore order and escort the troublemakers out of the city. Hakonians. The Hakonians were quite another kettle of fish, and universally popular, soft-hearted, incorrigibly romantic, and never at a loss for a word of praise. They were also known as Blarneykites because they spent the whole time paying people unsolicited compliments, flattering them, admiring their work or their appearance, and without payment rhapsodizing about everything and everyone in general. If you were feeling a bit depressed, your best plan was to go visit a Hakonian tavern where your spirits were bound to be restored. The Hakonians came to Hakonshire in the southwest Samonia, a region separated from the rest of the continent by a long trench. Legend had it that a Wotan, a god with little appreciation of good nature, was so infuriated by the Hakonians' amiability that he severed their homeland from Samonia with his huge axe. However, the resulting cleft was more likely to have been an ancient canal excavated by Zamonia's earliest Venetian midgets. Mandragores. The mandragores resident in Atlantis were rather affectionate semi-human plants of the deadly nightshade family. Originally from Greece, they had root-like arms and legs that enabled them to cling to people. This they constantly did because it was all they learned to do. They were eternally mystified by their failure to be richly rewarded for this trick, as they had been in their native habitat, where it was customary to pay mandragores for their embraces because they were reputed to bring you good luck when plowing. Raving Maenads. Also from Greece, but quite different in temperament, were the raving Maenads, devotees of the god Dionysius, who liked to dress up in animal skins and dance through the streets until they passed out. They had women's bodies and wildcats' faces, and were always accompanied by a band of satyrs, gifted flautists and wine-bibbers, and human features and muscular goat-like legs. The Venetian midgets were mine-workers, trolls from Tuscany, extremely industrious and fond of singing, but proud, vindictive, and inveterate strikers on principle. Withogs. Anyone looking for an intellectual challenge sought out the Withogs. These were very slim, philosophically gifted semi-pigs with a markedly ascetic streak. They lived exclusively on tea, milky porridge, and conversation. There were 2 of them to be found in every tea room in Atlantis, and it was only too easy to be drawn into a philosophical debate. If you weren't careful, a Withog could argue the chair away from under you and sit down on it himself. You had only make some untenable assertion, and a Withog would flatly contradict it. You did well to not overstep the mark, however, because a Withog was always prepared to fight a duel on behalf of his own opinion, and Withogs were amazingly nimble swordsmen. Midgard serpents and twerps. From the time to time, a colorful Midgard serpent would slither through the streets, as long and massive an anaconda and harmless as an earthworm. Scurrying behind it came a swarms of twerps who collected the serpent's slimy trail in buckets to make a suit alleged to render one immortal. This was never proved because the twerps, who lived at least 1,000 in any case, consumed it all themselves. Baalbek wormlets. Baalbek wormlets were nothing of the kind. That's to say, they weren't wormlets or even worms, but big spotty giants with bull's heads and 3 sinewy arms. No one knew how they got their name, because they bore not the slightest resemblance to worms, and came from Easter Island, not Baalbek. They had good manners, but peculiar habits, one of which was to bury themselves waist-deep in loose sand and mutter unintelligible prayers. It would be an impossible task to enumerate all the life forms that inhabited Atlantis. Here are a few of the continent's many other ethnic groups and tribes. Danish dune folk, halfway humans from the humongous mountains, Antarctic frigid trolls, Japanese bonsai mites, monasticavs, melusines, gorks, obliviogs, nine slayers, gibbetikins, elverines, norns, lemurs, poofs, ronkers, rumpelstilts, burps, thimbleskins, dogheads, ontivers, anklemen, paradise worms, bosoms, waterkins, gogmagogs, semi-mummies, prats, voltigorks, cinnamon, swarmazons, ventisnipes, bovasimians, cucumbrians, zebraskins, aquagenes, shadow pygmies, hellraisers, swamp orcs, snow scoops, sylvano sprites, peat witches, and a whole host of other almost unclassifiable mini-groups, and lone individuals of every kind. Even Bollogs were admitted to Atlantis, though only if less than 50 feet in height, and equipped with a head. A Bluebear attracted no attention in such surroundings. The Invisibles. Oh yes, to complete the picture I should add that there were also the so-called Invisibles, social misfits and radical dropouts who had retreated to the ancient, disused sewers of Atlantis. They never showed themselves in the street by day, only at night, and very seldom even then did they crawl out of their tunnels and into the open to perform the few really essential tasks that compelled them to remain in contact with the world above. There was even a rumor that the ones who did come to the surface were not true Invisibles, but their aides and intermediaries. Genuine Invisibles were said to be really invisible and not of this world. This, at any rate, was what parents told disobedient children, not forgetting to add a dire warning that Invisibles had a fondness for kidnapping fractious youngsters and hauling them off to their catacombs. The creatures that lived beneath the streets were rather like the sacred cows of Atlantis. Although they made no contribution to the common good, the city's inhabitants cherished a natural respect for them, partly out of fear and partly from superstition. At all events, it was the Atlanteans' invaluable custom to throw surplus foodstuffs, obsolete households, equipment, and other donations into the ancient sewers as sacrificial offerings to those who dwelt in the darkness. All they would hear was the eager rustling sound in the depths, and the gifts disappeared. This was why Atlantis had no beggars, no pavement dwellers, and no genuine poor, or none that were visible at least. Anyone who couldn't cope with the world of daylight vanished into the sewers and was never seen again. Atlantean architecture. The city displayed every conceivable form of architecture, plus a few more besides. Representatives of every nation that ever sailed the seas in ships had visited Atlantis at some stage and left their architectural traces behind. The descendants of some Egyptian pirates had erected, as Egyptians tend to do, several huge sandstone pyramids whose entrances were still being sought when I arrived in Atlantis. The dead were reputed not only to live inside them, but to go about their daily business there in the normal way. These gruesome rumors did not deter Atlanteans from using the terraces, which were almost completely overgrown with grass and creeper, as picnic sites on fine summer days. At night, however, when the pyramids creaked and groaned and weird bell music issued from deep inside, they gave them a wide berth. Arabs had constructed minarets and labyrinthine kasbahs made of low, whitewashed buildings. They were also responsible for those urban districts that consisted almost entirely of tents. The Italians, who had built vast cathedrals and lavishly decorated interiors and erected huge, ostentatious statues, preferred to live in narrow alleyways flanked by houses with peeling stucco walls and washing lines suspended between them. The Italians were also fond of ruins, so they partially demolished their show places and abandoned them to the weeds and the wild vine. What made these ruins so interesting, once they had been gnawed by the teeth of time, was that they were the ruins of ruins, and more ruined than you can get. The Menhir gnomes from Normandy had erected monoliths in every sizable square and opened little cafes around the sides. They served coffee so strong that it made your head wobble for hours and afterwards if you weren't used to it. At night, the granite dwarfs from the south of England, who were at the loggerheads with the Menhir dwarfs, knocked the monoliths over or constructed bizarre sculptures with them. It was one of Atlantis's abiding mysteries where the little creatures found the strength to do this. The most superficially primitive, but because of their monstrous size, visually impressive buildings in Atlantis had been erected by the Australian ant people. These were ant hills of immense proportions, many of their towers being several miles high. The ant people, human below the waist and foremost sign above, were respected for their diligence. The streets were spotless thanks to the indefatigable way in which they collected refuse free of charge and incorporated it into their towers. Thus the latter were really nothing more than ever-growing rubbish dumps with firmly cemented exteriors. The ant people's physical strength was impressive. They could carry objects 100 times their own weight, but they were loved less endowed with intelligence. It was impossible to converse with them about anything apart from their refuse collection and ant-hill construction, and even that had to be done in sign language, for which you really needed 2 antennae growing out of your head. You could also put your fists into your ears and waggle your forehead fingers, but as I have already implied, it wasn't worth the effort. Most of the city's temples were Indian, but so were the numerous rice kitchens on the outskirts, which were run by semi-elephants. These creatures were largely human and endowed with a pale blue elephantine head and 6 arms, which rendered them even more suited to running fast food restaurants than the 4-armed poofs, though the latter were better cooks. Since they could also use their trunks for prehensile purposes, they were capable of simultaneously stirring saucepans, shaking frying pans, filling plates, slicing onions, rinsing rice, washing up, and taking customers' money. Though delicious, all their curry dishes tasted the same. The Japanese bonsai mites inhabited a bonsai plantation of around 20 square yards, the smallest urban district in Atlantis, but immense by their standards. The bonsai quarter, whose inmates were little more than 1 inch high, was regarded as one of the city's favorite tourist attractions and enjoyed special protection. Enclosed by a strong wire mesh fence, it could only be viewed from outside and was additionally guarded by an impressive contingent of yetis. A glass roof shielded it from the elements because a single raindrop would have been sufficient to kill a bonsai mite stone dead. Big as skyscrapers, Atlantis' warlike-looking sandstone castles with hundreds of arrow slits had been built by Saracen pirates, but were now used mainly for storing junk. Proliferating inside them, so it was said, were innumerable cacker-trats, extremely unpopular creatures, of which more in due course. There were whole city districts whose builders had vanished without trace, strange towers and halls constructed of materials to be found nowhere else in Simonia, plastics and metals of sensational durability. Most of these buildings consisted of a material resembling burnished copper, but much harder and more imperishable. Although they had allegedly stood for thousands of years, no downpours or meteor storms had dulled or scratched their gleaming surfaces. Their windows were huge, circular, multicolored crystals that concentrated the light in a very economical way and distributed it over interior spaces. The floors and ceilings were made of glass-like substance that glowed green in the dark and seemed to breathe. Erected in the squares in these city districts were monstrous statues 5 times as big as those of the Italians. Portrayals of creatures unlike anything that existed in Simonia or elsewhere in the world. These statues were surprisingly enough of polished wood, though the wood came from trees as hard and durable as high-grade steel. Many of these buildings were governed by the strangest natural laws. Water flowed uphill in them, and they were allegedly haunted on a vast scale. The furniture, insofar as the outlandish objects jutting from their walls, floors, and ceilings could be described as such, was said aloud to hold nocturnal conversations. Not even the most hard-boiled citizens of Atlantis ventured to occupy these buildings, even though all their doors stood open. It was whispered that the Invisibles had lived there before they retreated to the sewers. Pagodas 100 stories high were a Chinese legacy. The Chinese had also, for some unknown reason, tried to bisect the city with a great wall and had lost interest at some stage. So all that remained of it was a low mound 18 inches high, 20 miles long, and breached in numerous places. The Vikings had left behind hundreds of elongated timber buildings, now used by Smorgård dwarfs, who tended the cauldrons of water that steamed on eternal fires inside them. Atlanteans liked to meet there on cold days to sweat and pay the dwarfs to thrash them with bundles of reeds, in their opinion, an aid to good health. In accordance with the proverb that a greenhouse arises wherever 2 Dutchmen meet, the Dutch had glassed over 2 whole city districts. These were now used for growing their giant tomatoes by corn demons of Celtic stock. Modes of transport. The Venetian midgets had nostalgically crisscrossed the entire city with canals on which they liked to spend their leisure hours, rowing colorful gondolas and belting out sentimental arias. You could get almost anywhere by way of these canals, provided you had a boat and knew your way around. Other forms of transportation included the underground tramway system, The aforesaid rickshaw demons, some domesticated Midgard serpents, giant snail coaches, romantic but slow, a large number of captive balloons, and a Zemonian version of the streetcar powered by Nightgalian ant motors, the tramway. The underground tramway was a complex network of tracks operated by dwarf miners and propelled by gravity. You entered an underground station somewhere in the city and were loaded aboard one of the tramcars, which were usually coupled together in tins. Then, having blown his horn, a dwarf miner in the leading car would release the brakes, and off you went, hell for leather, through tunnels illuminated by blazing torches. Traveling the tramway was not for the faint-hearted. You went downhill all the way from A to B, the sole mode of power deriving from the gradient and the weight of the cars and their occupants. At many points, the cars reached a speed of 100 miles per hour or more. On bends, the showers or sparks were very impressive, and there were derailments from time to time. At point B, you alighted with trembling knees and regained the daylight by way of a long spiral staircase. The tram cars were hoisted by means of ropes and tackle onto different tracks that led in many other directions. If your nerves were strong enough, you could reach almost every part of Atlantis by changing several times. Tethered balloons. Suspended above the city from pylons were cables along which captive balloons traveled. This guaranteed that the balloons, most of them equipped with spacious gondolas, were not too dependent on the winds. If the air currents were unfavorable, passengers could lend a hand and drive the airship along with the aid of a large propeller. Provided for this purpose was a long crankshaft running the length of the gondola within easy reach of every seat. The streetcar network was a municipal tax-funded system on which citizens could travel free of charge. It was manned by a permanent staff of ant people who were logically enough experts at maintaining ant motors. Ilstatna Boulevard. Cutting right across Atlantis was a broad boulevard known as the Ilstatna, an exclusively commercial thoroughfare offering every known commodity and service in the contemporary world, including restaurants to suit every nationality and outlandish dietary requirement. Simonian Wolpertingers, who were good chess players, had taken advantage of this to establish a chain of Wolpertinger chess cafes. Here, while eating snacks and drinking strong beer, customers could lose to a Simonian Wolpertinger at chess. Nobody had ever defeated a Simonian Wolpertinger, perhaps because nobody dared to. The fur-dressing salons were mainly patronized, of course, by furry creatures. They were run by Melusines, a hairless type of dwarf with a penchant for gossip and positively artistic way of wielding brush, comb, and scissors. I went there at least once a week, passing garlic bakeries, twerp tailoring establishments, Chinese laundries, tooth-pulling clinics run by Bloodums, fortune-tellers' tents in which Italian doombirds made dire predictions, betting shops, book care studios, herbal tea rooms, malediction bureau, where you could pay shamans to curse your enemies, dance halls, cryptic bookstores containing books found exclusively in Atlantis and written in still undeciphered languages, spitting taverns, where for a small charge you could spit it to your heart's content on sawdust-covered floors, burquette boutiques, fried ham stalls, cafes, boxing booths, beer gardens, and other products of Atlantean business acumen. Other life forms, other customs. The inhabitants of Atlantis had requirements that far transcended those of human beings. Gnomes, for example, no matter where they hailed from, found it hard to resist footwear made of reeds, with the result that there were countless shoe shops selling grotesque shoes woven from that material. Although non-gnomes would pass such establishments shaking their heads, they would be thronged with gnomes avidly trying on one reed shoe after another. Irish druids, for their part, had a love of austerity that manifested itself in other businesses as well. Druid shops were the bleakest places imaginable. All that most of them contained were some rickety shelves on which lay a few mossy stones, misshapen twigs, pieces of damp driftwood, yet in business hours the druids fought to get at these wares, as if they were the Ordian crown jewels. Atlantis also had its so-called rumor cookshops. Run by Ornian Doontoads, these were small establishments in which you could partake of doomers. The cooking was done at large circular wooden tables, round which the toads sat, busily smoking cigarettes and whispering together. Little by little their whispers, slanders, and unverifiable allegations combined to produce an interesting rumor that could be picked up, taken home, passed on. For instance, that the mayor of Atlantis secretly dined on the contents of trash cans at night. hide thrasheries were gloomy little establishments, most of them situated in basements, where Yalian dervishes thrashed uncured hides with heavy iron carpet beaters, singing melancholy songs in Yalian all the while. Only those who brought their hides to be beaten knew the purpose of this procedure, but they preserved a stubborn silence on the subject. And that was probably the whole secret of Atlantean society. Few minded what their fellow citizens got up to as long as they themselves were left in peace. Atlantean politics. Politics had really been a dead letter since the Zamodian War of Succession. In very early times, the various urban districts had been ruled by kings. Then, by employing a series of diplomatic stratagems, the Northlanders had taken over the reins of government, while the kings confined themselves to ceremonial duties. The latter did more than attend the opening of a few supermarkets, run marathons for charity, deliver graveside addresses at the funerals of prominent citizens, or turn up on major sporting occasions. One exception was King Snalitat of Tatalans, XXIII of Tatalans, who had lost his reason at some stage during the Zamodian War of Succession, and ran naked through the streets, making unintelligible government announcements. His last edict was that all Northlanders over the age of 13 be painted yellow and lined up in a row to have their feet tickled. The people of Atlantis really governed themselves, a system that worked well at times, less well at others, and sometimes not at all. Total chaos broke out about once a month. Either one of the dwarf communities would draw attention to some form of discrimination by clogging the sewers with toilet paper, or the rickshaw demons and the Venetian midgets would call a solidarity strike, thereby paralyzing the entire transport system and cutting off supplies of fuel. Absolute chaos in such a confined space very soon became intolerable, however, so everything calmed down after 2 days at most, and before any sensible strike demands could be put, let alone met, then everything returned to normal. Atlantis really functioned like an anthill. Although at first glance it looked completely chaotic and conformed to no discernible system, it held together and served a single common purpose, the survival and functional efficiency of a gigantic, alarming, wonderful, and incomprehensible city. A culture shock. To someone who had spent most of his previous life at sea, in the desert, on small islands, or in the enclosed labyrinth, such a massive concentration of different life forms and cultures was like a blow with an invisible club. I must have resembled someone who had just been hit on the head, as I darted through the streets of Atlantis open-mouthed, continually turning on the spot to marvel at some unfamiliar sight. Several hours went by before I paused at an intersection, each corner of which was guarded by a black marble lion, at least 300 feet high. It was late afternoon by now. Atlanteans were strolling, jostling, and shoving each other around me. My feet were beginning to ache, and I hadn't the slightest idea exactly where I was, where I wanted to go, or what there was for supper. I had hitherto been used to being given my food, or finding it in my natural surroundings. Nightingale's lessons had taught me that different laws prevailed in big cities, which meant, among other things, that you paid for your meals with money, to be precise. I had already noticed that Atlantean money consisted mainly of gold, silver, and copper pyramids of various sizes. In a Poof-run pizzeria, for example, you could buy a delicious maid's pancake, smothered in just about everything a person could eat. During the last hour, a Poof pizza had become for me the most desirable object in the universe. Pizzas were obtainable on almost every street corner, and wherever you walked or stood you could see chins draped in skeins of cheese from one of those pancakes with the alluring aroma. "Pretty impressive, Ga?" said a voice beside me. A tobacco dwarf named Kimluth Havera. It was a tobacco elf, a southern jungle dwarf of the rainforest family, creatures who normally liked to peruse their nefarious activities on tobacco plantations and had more or less normal dwarfish habits. That much I knew from Nightingale's classes. They were recognizable by their tastily garish, home-knitted caps, olive complexions, absurdly curly mustaches, and the gargling sound they made whenever they said an R. They also tacked a ga onto every remark they made. Depending on the context, this could mean all manner of things. Incidental note. Zamodian was spoken in Atlantis by common consent, fortunately, but every little ethnic group had smuggled his own dialect into the language. Many interspersed all they said with saliva-rich sibilants, others with hoarse bellows, and others prefaced every word with an "eh." The easiest to understand were the educated druids, who spoke academically precise High Zamodian. Least comprehensible were the horned imbeciles, who communicated with a croaking sing-song. They sounded like an opera singer, with a moth in his throat. But nobody conversed with the horned imbeciles in any case, so that problem, like so many others in Atlantis, resolved itself. Yes, indeed, I said absently, being engrossed in the sight of a bloodhound who was disposing of the poof pizza in 3 quick gulps. The lions, I mean. I awakened from my poof pizza trance. Oh, the lions. Yes, they're very fine, beautifully carved, lovely and smooth. God, they weren't carved, the dwarf replied almost lovingly. They were hand-polished, with paper handkerchiefs. Can you imagine how long it takes, to polish a sculpture like that out of marble with tissues? I tried to express my admiration. An amazing feat, I said, and meant it. They're inhabited, 4,000 apartments to each lion, running hot and cold water. No balconies, of course, but a mechanical elevator with music. He began to hum a Zimonian pop song. I don't see any windows. You can only see through the windows from inside. Clever, Brilliant. They belong to me. What, The lions. I own them. That's very impressive. Many congratulations. Like to buy one? What? Like to buy a lion? They're going very cheap. The trouble is I don't... Now listen to me. The dwarf lowered his voice and glanced anxiously in all directions. I'm taken to, That's why I'm going to quote you a very crazy price, 10 pyros. He proceeded to slap his own face to punish himself for making such an altruistic proposition. He cried at every slap. What an idiot I am. I'll never make a good businessman. I gave him a lingering stare. In Atlantis, 10 pyros would just about buy you a pizza. I felt offended. I must have looked an utter nincompoop for him to have tried to bamboozle me with the oldest tourist trick in the world. Okay, he said, and improved his offer. Call it 5 pyros. And that was how I got to know Kimbluth Havana, who became my best friend at Atlantis. Once I made it very clear to Kimbluth, first, that I hadn't escaped from a funny farm, and secondly, that I didn't have a pirate in my name. He promptly changed his tactics. He was determined to make money out of me somehow, quite how, he didn't know yet how, but he stuck to me like glue. You're something special, You're blue, you're a bear, you're a rarity, So he trotted along beside me, doing his best to talk me into all kinds of deals. Just stand on the street corner, you sing, I'll go around with the hat. I can't sing. We'll sell you to the zoo. At night, I'll come with the pass key and let you out. I had no wish to go into a zoo. Kimbluth Havana knew of a safe place to sleep at least. We walked for all of 2 hours, and the further we went, the stranger the neighborhood became. We began by trudging for miles along narrow, roughly cobbled alleys, spanning by washing lines. Then the houses became sparser and gave way to ruined palaces, colonnaded temples, thickly overgrown with brushwood and creeper, and stone monuments, of which many were threaded with cracks and had largely collapsed. It was evident that no one lived here apart from some feral cats that insisted on rubbing against our legs. A blue flash darted from the cobblestones, described a big electric arc, and disappeared down a crack. The alleyway was momentarily bathed in pale blue light. I gave a start and jumped back at least my own length. Kimbluth made a dismissive gesture. Grease lightning, he said, is harmless. From the Encyclopedia of Marvels, Lifeforms, and Other Phenomena of Zimonia and its Environs by Professor Abdullah Nightingale. Grease lightning, natural phenomena observed exclusively in the city of Atlantis for the past several hundred years. Generally bow-shaped and blue in color, electrical discharges come shooting out of the ground, usually at night. Although no adequate scientific explanation of them has yet been found, it has at least been ascertained that these shafts of lightning pose no health hazard other than the possibility of death by mental trauma. We crossed a broad open square in the midst of which a black obelisk, fully 60 feet high, projected skywards from a dried-up fountain. Several dozen cats lay in the basin, purring and licking their paws. Beyond the obelisk stood the biggest cathedral I'd so far seen in Atlantis. It was built of white marble and surmounted by a green cupola, a good third of which had fallen in. Our sleeping quarters, Kimbluth said with a grin. In the cathedral, a flight of steps as wide as one of the city's thoroughfares led up to the entrance, which was guarded by 2 stone cyclopses the height of the house. The door, or rather gates, stood open, as big as the stern of a 3-master. One of the gates had come off its hinges and crashed to the floor of the nave a long time ago. A swarm of pigeons fluttered into the air as we stepped over it into the ruined cathedral. Some lean brown shapes scurried off into the shadows at our approach. We climbed another big flight of steps to a gallery. The interior of the cathedral looked absurdly ill-constructed, probably because of its dilapidation. Steps led nowhere, half-demolished arches jutted pointlessly into space, fallen columns and shattered fragments of the cupola barred our path, overgrown with weeds. The sun's dying rays slanted down through the dilapidated roof, dramatically illuminating the headless, armless statues of the cathedral's niches. At one point, a huge half-relief carved into a red marble wall portrayed a robed Grim Reaper wielding a scythe. I didn't care for the place, but it would soon be nightfall, and I could afford to be this choosy. At least there aren't any Kakarats here, Ga? Kimluth remarked while we were collecting some big wads of moss to sleep on. Kakartrats? What are they? What are Kakartrats? Hard to say, Ga. Who knows? From the Encyclopedia of Marvel's Lifeforms and Other Phenomena of Zomoto and its Environs by Professor Abdullah Nightingale. Kakartrats, unpopular animal mutation combining the genus of pigeons, rats, and cockroaches. 4 to 5 feet long, Kakartrats are large canal rats with pigeon wings, bird-like beaks, and legs. The antennae of the digestive organs of cockroaches. Their sole legacy from the rat is a long rubbery tail. Even the most painstaking autopsies have failed to discover the Kakartrat's brain. The body's control mechanism is therefore assumed to be located somewhere in the gastrointestinal tract, which warns the bulk of the creature's innards. Also lacking is a heart, but this deficiency is offset by an outsized liver capable of digesting the most poisonous foodstuffs and facilitating the circulation of the blood, which resembles a putrid egg yolk in smell and consistency. Kakartrats prefer to hunt for their food under cover of darkness. Their diet consists mainly of household trash and carrion, but they will also attack sizable living creatures in times of famine. Kakartrats are the only known scavengers that devour the bones, toenails, and eyelashes of their prey. Ugh, are you sure there aren't any Kakartrats here? You can never be absolutely sure of anything. I was beginning to have my doubts about Kimluth's qualifications as a tourist guide. How often have you spent the night here? Oh, often. How often? Lots of times. Come on now, how many times? Or once? Once? Honestly, when was that? All right. Tonight's the first time, Ga. There's always has to be a first time. Happy now? Can we get some sleep at last, Ga? I took in Kimluth Havana only a few minutes to make the transition from rhythmical breathing to a dreamer's happy little whimpers, whereas I lay awake for ages. The events of the day, the many impressive sights I'd seen, my pangs of hunger, and first and foremost, our eerie sleeping quarters, all of these conspired to give me no peace, even if half ruined. Why should such a magnificent building be deserted? I had seen people living in tents and corrugated iron huts, so why not this part of the city where hundreds of grand buildings stood empty, moldering away to no purpose? I remembered how the local inhabitants had stared after us, shaking their heads as we made for the cathedral. I thought of my uncertain future in the bewildering city, and then I fell asleep after all, overcome by sheer exhaustion. A dream. I dreamed that Kimluth and I were moving into an apartment in one of the Marble Islands. It was really a vast kitchen living room equipped with several luxurious stoves on which mighty beefsteaks were sizzling. I dreamed of big ovens in which sybaritically topped poof pizzas were blowing cheesy bubbles, of huge saucepans in which rich soups simmered over open fires. It was my job to sample these soups with a ladle several feet long. Whenever I managed to spoon some up, however, the apartment grew bigger and bigger and my ladle longer and longer, with the result that I couldn't put it to my lips. I lost my temper and hurled the ladle through the window, whereupon dozens of Kakartrats came fluttering in through the hole and proceeded to gobble everything up. One of them alighted on my chest and began to nibble my eyelashes. Its weight was unendurable. I felt it. I was suffocating because the creature was also devouring my breath. No dream. Then I woke up and the reality was almost worse than my nightmare. An 8-legged lesser olfactol sat perched on my cheek, inhaling my mouth odor with avid squeaks. Meanwhile, a fat chimera had hunkered down on my chest and was regarding me with an impudent grin. I let out a yell and brushed the olfactol off my cheek. It landed on the flagstones, scuttled off zigzag fashion, and disappeared down a crack. I lashed out at the chimera with my fist, but it skillfully dodged the blow, fluttered into the air, and vanished into the shadows with a bleating laugh. I leapt to my feet, screaming, and bombarded Kimluth with reproaches. Still half asleep, he hadn't a clue what was wrong. You had a bad dream, Guy, he said indifferently. Go back to sleep. It wasn't a dream. There was a thing on my chest and another on my face. At that stage, I didn't know what olfactals and chimeras were, but it wouldn't have made much difference to my state of mind if I had known. I was far too agitated even to sit down. I stood there breathing heavily and scanned the bewildering maze of the shadows of the cathedral's interior. Darkness flickered over the walls like black flames. Something uttered a snarl. There are animals in some kind in here, I whispered. Poof, a few rats, perhaps, said Kimlith, trying to reassure me. Lie down again? Gah. The timbers overhead creaked, and I was briefly showered with flakes of plaster. Tiny particles of some ancient mural painting rained down on me. Peering at them in the moonlight, I made out beautifully painted foliage, fragments of hands, apples, angels' wings, eyes. Then a bell tolled, a single muffled note as if a large bird had flown into it. The sound lay heavy on my heart. Silence returned. Kimlith slowly sat up, staring past me wide-eyed. He pointed to something behind my back. Gah, he said. I heard a flutter of heavy wings, and something raked my head with its hard, sharp talons, and disappeared, snarling into the darkness. Warm moisture was trickling down my neck. Afraid that some disgusting creature, probably a cacotrat, had excreted its unspeakable bodily fluid onto me, I explored the warm, sticky substance with my paw. Although it looked jet black in the moonlight, I knew it was blood. It took very sharp talons to pierce a bluebear's fur. Blood? I queried. Vampiros, Kimlith replied. Vampires. Then came the first attack. Snarling, a streak of black lightning sped towards me from the darkest corner of the cathedral. A muscular cat the size of a full-grown mastiff. It had the face of a maddened baboon and accelerated its progress through the air by flapping the short wings that sprouted from its shoulders. And then just before it reached me, something strange happened. The whole sequence of events seemed quickly to go in slow motion, and I was pervaded by a profound feeling of calm. The cat, monkey, bat, took an infinite length of time to cover the last yard between us, time enough for me to study its musculature, draw my own conclusions therefrom, calculate its angle of attack, take one step forward, simultaneously lean over backwards, with the result that my attacker missed me altogether. I had a clear view of the monkey cat's grimace of dismay as it soared over my head. I even had time to draw back my forepaw, slowly and powerfully, and deliver a well-aimed blow to the creature's solar plexus that catapulted it out of its trajectory and sent it sailing through the air for yards. With a crash, it landed on its back in the hard marble floor, then bounced out of the nave like a broken clockwork toy yelping with pain. Gah, Kimlith said respectfully. That was quick. The process that had seemed so infinitely slow had actually lasted only a split second, although it didn't dawn on me until later. This marked the awakening of my innate predatory instincts. I was a bear, after all. Those instincts had been dormant thanks to my previous upbringing, but somehow had now been unwise enough to attack me and activate my atavistic, earth-sign defense mechanisms. I threw back my head and let out a spine-chilling roar whose reverberations took a long time to die away. Then two of the vampire bat cats sprang at me simultaneously. I ducked, and one went crashing into the remains of a column behind me. The other I plucked out of the air by the hind leg. Whirling it around my head 3 times like a hammer thrower, I hurled it back in the direction it had come from. It must have hit some of its own kind, because a chorus of angry, agonized snarls went up when it landed. Then peace returned. Ha ha, chortled Kimlith. That's that, Gath, I won't be back. Vampires are cowardly creatures. He spat contemptuously on the ground and tried to give me an admiring slap on the back, but only succeeded in patting my elbow because of our difference in height. At that moment, some 15 vampire cats converged on us from all directions, while 5 more attacked us from the air. Like all tobacco elves, Kimlith was ignorant of fear. It wasn't that he was courageous, because you can't be courageous unless you know what fear is and overcome it. It was simply that tobacco elves were completely devoid of that emotion because they had green blood in their veins and no adrenaline. Tobacco elves noticed when they were in danger, but simply didn't care. If attacked by a 9-foot jungle gorilla, they wouldn't stop to think that they might come off worse by plunging into the fray without more ado. Infinitely superior opponents were often so disconcerted that they turned pale. This made tobacco elves extremely efficient and redoubtable fighters, despite their small stature. Being a jungle dweller himself, Kimlith knew where best to hit a predatory apes and jungle cats, on their moist, sensitive noses. Hit the mark, and one well-aimed thrust of the finger was enough to put a vampire cat out of action for minutes on end. Kimlith excelled at a South Brazilian sport known as... I can't read that. I don't know what that is. I cannot pronounce that. He even possessed a colorful embroidered belt that marked him out as an adept for the ninth grade. When performing this elegant cross between flamenco dancing, karate, and bullfighting, he simply stood there, scarcely moving from the spot, with one hand on his hip and the other poised above his head like a cobra about to strike at any moment. Simultaneously, he turned on his own axis with little mincing steps and stamped his foot from time to time, lending the contest an almost balletic rhythm. Then swiftly stepped aside so that a vampire cat sailed past him into the space and went crashing into the wall. Every now and then, clamping two fingers together and striking downwards with lightning speed, he would drive them into an adversary's nose or a sensitive spot below the ribs, humming a bossa nova as he did so. Less deliberate and well-rehearsed, my own technique was spontaneous and instinctive. I was amazed at the strength that had been slumbering unutilized within me. The bear is regarded as one of the most dangerous wild animals on this planet, but I had yet to grasp that because I'd been too busy roaming subterranean labyrinths, sitting on a school bench, and engaging other non-ursine activities. One blow from my paw sufficed to send a vampire cat somersaulting through the air. One bite, and another of the creatures retreated into the shadows, whimpering with pain. I dished out punishment with speed and vigor, never missing the mark, never making an unnecessary move, or neglecting to keep my guard up like a professional boxer equipped with claws. If the vampires had really been as cowardly as their reputation suggested, they would long ago have quit the field of battle, but they persevered no matter how much we hurt them or how hard they landed on the ground. They merely withdrew into the dark corners of the cathedral and then resumed the attack. They had a simple but effective tactic. They operated in shifts. When half of them became tired, they withdrew to lick their wounds, and the other half took over. Kimluth and I were exhausting ourselves, whereas they could recoup their energy again and again. They were bound to defeat us in the end. One big vampire cat had crept up behind me and buried its fangs in my fur. Another was crouching in front of me, clawing painfully at my legs, and a third was fluttering overhead, snapping at my muzzle. The strength had run out at last, I realized, scarcely able to lift a paw. I was debating whether to drop my guard and abandon myself to my fate when the vampires backed off and withdrew as if in response to a secret word of command. Badly disheveled and gasping for breath, we were suddenly all alone. The air was throbbing to an unfamiliar, ominous sound, an electric pulsation rather than like the chirping of enormous crickets. Cacatratas, said Kimluth. What? Cacartrats, guy, lots of them, cacartrats. 20 or 30 feet away, on the floor of the cathedral seemed to have come alive. A jostling mass of creatures was advancing on us. Here and there I could see long antennae quiver in the night air. From time to time, when a cacatrat fluttered wildly into the air, one could briefly discern its hideous silhouette in the moonlight before it sank back into the milling throng. I thought there weren't any cacatrats in here. I hoped the subdued reproach in my voice was clearly perceptible. Oh, cacatrats, they've no style, Kimluth snorted contemptuously, always turning up where they're not wanted. That wasn't altogether true. The cacatrats had temporarily saved our lives, at least. Only so as to kill us themselves, perhaps, but still the vampire cats had beat a retreat. They were obviously creatures endowed with common sense. I know, Kimluth suggested. We'll simply make a dash for the door. Of course, why not? Cacartrats continued. Persons who encounter one or more cacartrats would be well advised not to move too quickly, but to favor a fluid balletic mode of progression. Cacartrats react to abrupt, hurried movements only. Not possessing a brain, they assume that anything in fluid motion is water. That was a tip from the same stable as the one who adjured you to remain absolutely still when a Tyrannomobius Rex swam towards you or an angry Boranth charged you with its horn lowered. I found it very difficult to muster sufficient faith in this piece of advice. My instinct would have been to run down the steps screaming and waving my paws, but I did my utmost to move like a ballerina in slow motion. Walk very slowly, I hissed between my teeth. They'll mistake us for water. Kimberly stared at me mistrustfully. Gah? They'll think we're water? What gives you that idea? I've got an encyclopedia in my head. It sometimes tells me things like that, I whispered as I descended the steps with my forelegs out sideways like a tightrope walker on a slanting rope. Gah, so you've got an encyclopedia in your head, I understand. Well, not an encyclopedia exactly. It's really a nocturnomath with 7 brains. He can see in the dark and open a can of sardines by willpower. I can hear him inside my head. Kimluth gave me the sort of look you give a delirious fever patient. Listen, he said, you've temporarily lost your wits, but that's all right, gah. It's no disgrace, considering the danger we're in. I'm taking over command, gah. We'll simply run down the steps with our arms out, yelling blue murder. I looked down the steps. No, I said. That's just what we won't do. Why not? Because, I jerked my snout at the bottom step. Another contingent of the Cacatrat army was climbing the steps. Thousands more were following the line abreast for the cathedral door. The huge insects were pouring into the cathedral through broken windows and cracks in the walls. We were completely surrounded. "We're going to die," I said. "God, we're going to die." Kimluth didn't contradict me for once, but I could tell that he was looking for some way of putting a good face to the situation. Nothing occurred to him. The Kakrtrats came swarming up the steps in a broad black wave. The electrical crackle of their Kakrtratian language was amplified many times over by the cathedral's echoes. Something was moving beneath my foot. In the gloom I had trodden full on a Kakratrat. I leapt aside in disgust and picked up a piece of stone, intending to smash the insect's skull. I was raising it above my head in both paws when I saw I hadn't trodden on a Kakratrat at all. The step was sinking. So was the one below it and the one below that. In the midst of the flight of steps was a hole big enough to admit a horse. Kimluth jumped into it without a moment's hesitation. "Gah," he called from below. "Come on, jump, it isn't deep." I hurled a stone at the massive Kakratrat, shattering one of the insects